about how we can really fight these things and how we overcome them. And the first thing I want to say is that there was a debate amongst the ancients about nature and nurture. Are we just victims of our nature, and can we actually nurture ourselves or be nurtured out of these basic tendencies that we have? And the answer to that in our tradition is that even a dog can be taught to hunt for you, and a falcon can be taught to hunt for you. That we can actually train animals and change their nature so that they become. In fact, with knowledge, the dogs, even though normally you would not eat from a dog, but if a dog is mu'allam, if it's taught, and that's the actual word that the Quran uses, if it's taught, if it has ilm, then it's elevated to a higher status, and what it hunts is halal. And so knowledge is the way that we overcome these things. But here, and this is where it gets really, really important, the most important and single truth that we all have to understand if we want to actually change ourselves and overcome ourselves is that we can't do it by ourselves. That is the most fundamental truth. If you think that you can change, then not only do you have pride, but you will never be able to conquer yourself. You will never be able to overcome your appetites. You will never be able to overcome whatever tribulation you have. The only way that you can do that is through supernatural power. And that supernatural power is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's the imdad that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us. Allah is the one that can enable us to do that. Without Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you cannot do it. And so people try and try again and again and again. I keep failing. I tried so many times. Exactly, you tried because you did not rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But if you rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you can overcome it. And one of the things that secularists hate is that the single most successful addiction treatment program is the 12-step program. And the reason why it's successful is because they begin by admitting their powerlessness to overcome their addiction. They have to acknowledge a power greater than them. And that's the only way that they can do it. And that's why it's successful. That is the single reason that it's successful. And they use a prayer. The prayer that they use is the prayer of Reinhold Niebuhr, who is probably one of the most famous Protestant theologians of the 20th century, at least in the Western Hemisphere. But he wrote a book called Moral Man in an immoral society, in which he argued that a lot of sinfulness is because everybody's doing it. That when you have a society that is moral, people tend to be more moral. But when you have a society that's immoral, people slip into sin much easier. And that's why it's a challenge for righteous people to be moral in an immoral society, because they're going against the grain. But how do they do that? How do we become moral beings in a culture that is constantly assaulting us with gluttony, with lust, with envy? I mean, it's amazing how they use envy to sell products and to make you envious of what other people have. Lifestyles of the rich and famous. All of these tools that they have in their toolbox become powerless when you acknowledge La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. There is no power. There is no power to do obedience. La hawla an al-ma'asi wa la quwwata ala ta'a. There's no way to avoid obedience, and there's no power to enable me to avoid disobedience. There's no ability to avoid disobedience, and there's no power to be obedient except with God, except through God. That's one of the meanings of La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. And so Ibn Ata'illah says something amazing. He says, من استغرب أن ينقذه الله من شهوته وأن يخرجه من وجود غفلته فقد استأجر قدرة إلهية. Whoever deems it strange, or does not think that God can save him from his appetites and remove him from the state of his heedlessness, he has deemed divine power to be powerless, to be incapacitated. So that is istighrab here means istib'ad. He deems it unlikely that God can save him from his own appetites. That so once you acknowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one only that can do that, then you have the capacity to do it. Without it, you can't do it. And that's why it's really important to remember that وَكَانَ اللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ مُقْتَدِرًا. Allah is capable of doing all things. In fact, Ohio, the state motto of Ohio, I think they tried to change it, but it says, with God all things are possible. And that is a metaphysical truth that is acknowledged even in a state motto. Well, so if you're suffering right now from some kind of addiction, if you're suffering from, if you're going on a pornographic site, if you find yourself doing these things over and over again, and you don't think God can take you out of that state, then you have incapacitated the power of God. And so what you have to do, the first thing you have to do is acknowledge, I am powerless, but God is all powerful. And through God, I can remove these things. Allah will enable me. The divine istita'a. This is what Imam al-Tahawi in his Aqidah talks about. The two types of capacity. The divine capacity, the divine enablement. And then the human enablement of means and things. When those two come together, that's when reality happens. So you have to acknowledge that with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you do that, you will be able to overcome. But then, and this is where Ibn Atta'illah is one of our truly great spiritual geniuses. He says, رُبَّمَا وَرَدَتَ الظُّلَمَ عَلَيْكَ لِيُعَرِّفَكَ قَدْرَ مَا مَنَّ بِهِ عَلَيْكَ. Sometimes these dark things that you fall into are a means by which God causes you to realize the blessings of being in a state of obedience. So that's really important. That sometimes your appetites happen to show you the blessing of being able to contain yourself, to restrain yourself from those appetites. So it's what they call in Alcoholics Anonymous, falling off the wagon. That will happen in your struggle. And that's why the nafs al-lawama, those are the good people. You're not at mutma'inna yet, but you're fighting it. So if you fall, you just get back on. If you fall, you get back on. If you fall, you get back on. That's the path. And I was once in Kuwait with Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, and we were in the airport, and there was a soccer team that came from one of the Arab countries, and they were all young men, athletes. They looked very, really in good shape and everything. And Sheikh, mashallah, he has that beautiful aspect, and he just has the haiba of the scholars. And we were sitting, and this athlete came up to him, and he was wearing these athletic clothes with the team name on it. And he came up and he kneeled down before Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, and he told him, he said, I struggle constantly with sinfulness. Astaghfirullah, I do things and then I make tawbah, and I go back and I do things, I make tawbah. And I just feel disgusted with myself. And Sheikh Abdullah looked at me, he said, Istamir. Keep going. Keep struggling. That's it. There's a hadith Qudsi that the Prophet ﷺ said that Shaitan swore an oath to God, I will lead all of your servants astray. And I will ummihim, I will put in them desire for sin, and they will sin. And Allah said to Shaitan, and as long as they turn back to me, I will continue to forgive them. So it's that's it. That's the path. It's you fall, you get back up, but you don't let Shaitan win. And the way you don't let Shaitan win is you keep making that tawbah with an azima to conquer your appetite, and you will do it. It can take. Ibn al-Munkadir, who's one of the great scholars of Islam, he was really considered one of the greatest of the tabi'een. He was amazing man in Medina. He was Imam Malik's teacher, and Imam Malik ibn Anas said, we used to go to Ibn Munkadir and we would feel contempt for ourselves for weeks after sitting with him because he was so amazing. Like his spiritual state was so exalted. Ibn Munkadir, I mean, this is a man who Malik ibn Anas was in awe of. He said, I fought myself for 50 years before it finally surrendered. So that's the path. It's that struggle. And if you don't know the blessings of obedience and practice, and you're not grateful for them, they'll be taken away from you. And that's why his next hikmah is من لم يعرف قدر النعم بوجدانها عوقب بوجود فقدانها. That whoever does not know the weight of the blessings when he has them, his punishment is to know them once he's lost them. And so our basic state when we're children is innocence, and we enter into adulthood and we begin to sin, and then that darkens our souls. But you polish the soul with tawbah and with good deeds and with good actions and with knowledge and all these things, and that's the struggle. It's a harb sijal, it's a war of attrition, us versus shaitan. And if you're a believer, you will win in the end, even if it takes a long time. So the single most important thing for you to overcome yourself is not to rely on yourself, but to rely on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَعَلَىٰ رَبِّهِمْ يَتَوَكَّلُونَ. On their Lord they rely. That's tawakkul. And this is why Imam al-Ghazali, in his genius, he put in his Ihya, the chapter on Tawheed is called Tawheed wa Tawakkul, because it's through seeing the unity of God and seeing God behind everything that you're able to trust in God, because you're aware that He is omnipresent with His knowledge. He's with us always, and He will never abandon us as long as we call on Him. He is a generous Lord. He will never abandon us as long as we call on Him. And whatever sin you might be in, you have to know, all you have to do is turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with tawbah. He is a tawwab. And that's who our Lord is. He's the oft returning. As long as you return to Him, He will return to you. In udtum udna. If you come back to me, I'll come back to you. That's what He said to Bani Israel. The Jews can turn to God anytime they want. They were His chosen people. He elevated them. He privileged them above humanity. He gave them so many gifts. And He reminded them, "Udhkuru ni'mati alaykum." Remember the blessings that I gave upon you. They were given all those prophets, all those things. But if they're in sinfulness, if they're in disobedience, we should want good for them. We should want guidance for them, because they're children of prophets. Who wouldn't want good for children of prophets? Awlad Ya'qub. And so that's our tradition, is to struggle with the self until the self submits to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But it's recalcitrant, and that's the nature of the soul. It will fight, and we have to fight better, more intelligent, more strategic, and inshallah Allah will give us tawfiq. Alhamdulillah.